So I was thinking about dreams and how dreams at night are the brain's way of trying to bring order to the day's experience or past days' experiences. And so at night, a person may or may not dream. And they might dream about something that happened during the day, or they could dream about something from the past. In this way, the brain is sort of continuing to think while it's asleep. It's not quiet. And sometimes people don't dream at all, or at least they don't remember their dreams. And to me, a person that dreams may be trying to work stuff out in their life. And in the same way, a person that has psychosis or mania, which is like having dream elements projected into daily life, may be needing to work out some internal stuff, unfinished business, and things to a higher degree than the people that manage to do it through dreams. And interestingly enough, many times when somebody goes into a state of psychosis or mania, they haven't been sleeping. So perhaps they haven't been sleeping, they haven't been dreaming. Or maybe it's that they are dreaming, but they're awake dreaming. So their sleep time, that's usually sleep dreaming, is now still dreaming time, but it's while the person is awake, so they're not getting sleep. Plus, the dream elements are being projected and causing trouble in daily life, like say what's called hallucinations or delusions, which could just be like sleepwalking while actually awake. And that's just something I'm thinking about. I'm not saying this is true, or it's just a conversation. And I feel it's important to talk about this stuff and think about it differently because it's so fascinating, and I'm speaking about it from my own experience, not from, oh, I read this in a textbook. It could be in a textbook somewhere or in a book somewhere, but from my own experience, it does feel like I'm sort of awake in a dreamland. And maybe we're all awake in a dreamland, but the dream element shuts off for the most part in most people. But perhaps if we're not sleeping, the dream element comes in and messes up the daily reality. But why do we dream at all? It seems like it's the subconscious way of reorganizing stuff. So basically, this dreaming while awake could be a way to reorganize a person's reality, because there's elements that need to be reorganized. And this could, in my case, I experienced trauma, and it was hard for my brain to deal with that trauma. So a way for it to be dealt with was perhaps to create a mental health crisis or challenge, which definitely made my internal subjective reality not really congruent with the outer reality. And this is just perhaps a way of the psyche's healing process. I believe in holotropic breathwork. They talk about how the psyche is always attempting to heal itself. It's a self-healing mechanism. So psychosis and mania could be some kind of self-healing process, but it's met with opposition. It's met with the interpretation of being a disease, like a permanent thing, when it's not a permanent state. Most times people don't stay in that kind of state forever, and coming out of it is usually attributed to medication. But how many people are allowed to possibly go through the process without medication? And perhaps maybe it would resolve eventually on its own. If it's a healing mechanism, a healing process, perhaps it eventually corrects itself. Just like if we're sleeping and we have a dream, eventually the dream stops. eventually we wake up. If we were to think everybody that was sleeping was like dead, then and bury them before they woke up, well, then we would be really silly. So just because that happens, there's not many opportunities to go through it in a safe way and have it finish, almost like a longer sleep dream period. Imagine it takes, for example, say it takes 30 days on average. Now, a person needs a nice sanctuary for those 30 days to go through the process. But instead, it's stopped. The process is stopped through chemical means, and then it's assumed because a person had that happen that they have some sort of disease when it was never allowed to go through its process. And it's also assumed that if you allow it to continue, it's only going to get worse. And I'm not sure where the proof lies in this, but there's a lot of fear that is put into it. And, it may be true, but I'm not sure. I would like to see that there be options, especially because there are some people that choose not to take the medications. But it still is a process that a person needs to be kept safe, and they need to be guided, because it's a very delicate place to be. So what I'm talking about is revisioning mental health. And revisioning is just that, providing different ways to see it, to look at it, to think about it, and that will create new avenues and new possibilities. And that's really important. They do talk about reframing, so reframing things to look at it differently. And reframing could be, for example, sometimes I reframe my experience by saying, I take medication to keep me grounded in this reality that we all share. I take medication to keep me seeing consensus reality. Is this the only reality? In my mind, no. Is this the best reality that's out there? No, it's not. But it's the one we all share. And that's the one where I can be most congruent and not bump into incongruencies in my inner subjective experience and the outer. There's still incongruencies, or I still have a sense, for example, like I can see this injustice or that injustice, which we can all do that, which just means we see the world as it is and we don't think that it should be that way. And with some of my different states of consciousness where I've experienced what's called mania and psychosis, I see the world, and then I also see more possibilities. So in mania, I like to think of it as seeing so many possibilities in everything I see. Possibilities to make things better, or see it differently, or experience it differently, or for it to have different meaning than it usually does. It's a very new state. It's not, I see something, I look at something, and it feels like nothing new. There's almost no perception of it. So after a while, if we're experiencing the same thing all the time in the same routine, we get adapted, and we don't even see things that are in our daily life. So we might not even see that there's a picture on the wall, even though it's been there for the whole time. Or we just don't notice things. So mania is like noticing everything and then some, and noticing what's implicit in what we notice, and like reading between the lines. And in that way, it's a very energetic state, and it's very exciting. And psychosis is similar, but it's also, there's a lot of scary associations. So instead of associating a certain item with something beautiful and possible, with lots of potential and wonderful, it resonates with some kind of trauma from the past, or relating it to some kind of biblical horrific event, or the mind changes it into all negative feelings of things. And since it's a negative feeling state and one feels very negative and terrified, everything is flavored with that terrified nature. So any terrifying association that is possible can potentially come into one's conscious awareness. But again, it's not congruent with reality. So I might just see a scary picture on the wall, and what it is a scary picture on the wall. That doesn't mean that something horrible is going to happen to my neighbor, which, my mind might make that up as a story because it's in that state of feeling completely terrified, even though there is really no good reason. So the feeling of the terrified creates reasons. So the mind starts to make up reasons everywhere why I should and could be terrified. And just like the opposite of mania, being extremely elated and joyful and happy, it sees, the brain can see, the mind can see every reason possible to be happy and joyful. So this is different than the normal consensus state of kind of not noticing anything. So just in the normal state, it's just noticing what we usually notice, and there's not much that's new. Whereas in mania, everything seems new and one is noticing everything. And perhaps it is important for some people to notice more things sometimes, because if we all got habituated to our routines, like if tomorrow we were all habituated to our routines forever, we would just be robots. So to me, I actually feel like these experiences of organic changes in states of consciousness are actually, in a way, evolutionary. Because if we were able to be so easily conditioned and programmed into habit with no way of really getting out of it, as they say now, it takes 30 days to change one little habit. Just to change, say, eating an apple a day takes 30 days perhaps to actually form that as a habit. That's a pretty slow process for one little habit, because we can't even change very many habits in one go. But if a person all of a sudden enters a state of mania, everything changes in an instant, and everything's new, and everything's different, and everything is possible, and everything is magical. And if some of us didn't experience some of this sometimes, we would probably be a monotonous, ubiquitous species of drones by now. I actually feel like these states of consciousness, or these, so-called pathological mental illnesses, are actually completely necessary, because the people that go through them lose their ability to be programmed, and they lose their ability to remain in the habits that actually define them as the people they are. And then we say, well, what happened to this person? They're no longer who they were, so they're ill. And I think that is a very limited way of looking at it. It really means, wow, good, that we can't be programmed into something. If you could imagine that some supreme dictator came from an alien race, just one dictator, and was like, okay, you guys, you all have to listen to me because I came from this alien race, and I appeared out of nowhere, and and so everyone's like bowing down. And then all of a sudden they spell out the gospel of what we're supposed to be like, and we say, okay, because you're magical and you came out of the sky, and this person or this entity was so easily able to program us. We're not going to be able to be programmed by that thing because of mental illness or psychosis or extreme states of consciousness. A certain number of us are going to rebel, not because we want to, but just because that is actually innately programmed into us. Not programmed, but it's an innate part of us by the intelligence of however we were designed or created, however you choose to believe that came about. So there's always been people that go mad, as is called, but really it's just a way for the psyche or the being or the consciousness to rebel and clear itself of its own programming. And to say that, oh, the human or the person is ill, I feel that's limited, because basically new programming can be installed, and unfortunately the one that's installed is you're mentally ill, you're defective, you don't have the same functioning, so obviously there's something wrong with you, when it could be by like a divine act of grace that this person's ego was erased and something else can flower, something else can take root. Maybe we're not meant to be the same ego that we are our whole entire life. How many people would love to start over? How many people would love to have everything erased and create something new? But we're not given this opportunity because we're assumed that we should try to get as much of ourselves back that we lost. Like, oh, that was so valuable, that programming that you got through your childhood, through your upbringing, through your schooling, through the media. Like, oh, that's so valuable. We got to get that back. You got to recover. No, maybe you have to rediscover and recreate yourself anew. And if it was received in a caring way, as if it's almost like the birth of a newborn baby, even though the person is a young adult or an adult, it's almost like a person is returned to innocence. And sometimes, yes, there's bad behavior in a person, because it's almost like the person realizes that they're being deprogrammed and they're not being cared for. They're being treated as if they're the same person. And I feel like there's a certain element of deprogramming. Yes, the person does retain some elements of the personal self. Most of the time, a person's voice isn't going to change. Most of the time, a person's looks aren't going to change that much. But the ego, we're assuming the ego structure is the person. So we're saying this person gets mentally ill, but really the ego is torn apart, and the ego isn't that real to begin with. So to say, like, there's a crisis happening within the person, but it could be more to stir up the ego and sort of, mix it up and tear it apart and mix it up and put the pieces back together and see what happens. And certain elements of the pieces of the puzzle don't fit anymore, and some still do. And a person after that experience often loses the ability to function in society. But the ego is actually a product of society. So a person, as their ego self, in their particular situation in society, they're going along, and then for some reason that falls apart, the ego falls apart. The person's not going to function the same way in the same situation. That ego is implicit in the situation that the crisis happened in. So to put a person back in that situation and expect that that's going to be good, that's the situation that led to the crisis in the first place. So what I'm saying is, a lot of it has to do with a person needing to change their life, and sometimes if a person doesn't change their life and doesn't manage to change their life, the ego structure falls apart and then they have to change their life. But it's not get the ego back and go back to the same life. It's still, I feel, a call to really change one's life. Because society as it is, and the egos that we are, they're conditioned, they're programmed. Like, how many of us pretend? Like, how many of us are really thinking about the laws of society as we're going about our day and how we should be acting? Well, all those are false structures, and while it seems that society has a relatively stable order, not everybody is stabilized by that order. So those structures of society and those programs and those conditionings, they work for a lot of people. But a lot of people actually fall apart under these structures. And then because of that, a person is said to be mentally ill, when perhaps we actually need to work towards designing society for some people that don't actually fit into the society that we've designed. Not in that they don't fit in as people, but that they don't fit in, like, for example, maybe we're not designed to work 40 hours a week, every week, for almost every week of the year. Whereas, say, for example, a person that goes through one of these crises and comes out the other side, perhaps can get just as much done in 40 hours a month as someone can in 40 hours a week, if the person working the 40 hours a month that's gone through the crisis has free reign to do the hours when they can. So it's not based on time, on assuming that everybody can just pull themselves together for 9 to 5 every day. The fact that anyone can do that is a miracle. And, more and more people are having these crises and things, or crises, I guess I should say. So that's just a small example that perhaps it's also in the design of society. It's also in the design of how we're educated. Like, how long are kids going to be able to continue to sit at a desk for 6 hours a day for the entire year, for so many years of their life? That's pretty outdated. And it's all about control. It's all about learning, and I don't even know if they're changing the way learning happens, because to have to memorize all this stuff is just ridiculous in the day of having an external memory and an external brain processor like a smartphone. And it's more important to know how to think than be programmed to remember what to think and what to say and what knowledge is. So it's more about inquiring and questioning, being able to ask those questions instead of answer a question when asked, being able to recall something. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, a crisis could be an invitation for evolving oneself to a different version of oneself. And there's so much pressure after a crisis, I know, to get back to oneself, to get back to who everyone else knows me to be. But maybe I'm not that person. Maybe I don't want to be that person anymore. And maybe that's okay. And maybe if people were told, you've lost elements of your ego, you've lost elements of your thought structure, you've lost elements of maybe your beliefs, but you're not your beliefs, you're not your thoughts, you're not what you were told to remember, you're not your memories. What is possible, and maybe a lot of the things that are possible are some of the things that happened in the more positive elements of the crisis. But in the positive, one goes equal opposite to, say, the negative side, and then as one comes out of the negative, maybe a person can incorporate elements of the positive after coming out of the negative. But so often, coming out of the negative implies you should get back to yourself, how you were. You should go back to being who you were, so your people that know you are comfortable, and you should get back to the exact job you were doing and recover. And to me, it's also about rediscover, recreate. If I lost 50% of my ego structure, which equates to, oh, you're not functioning, like you're not functional, we have to train you how to think and function again. Maybe it's not just about functioning. Maybe it's about that so many elements of who I was were dysfunctional in that they're not who I truly am. And who I truly am, I don't know who that is. And I don't think I will ever know. So if certain parts of me were lost, certain parts of me who I thought I was were lost during a crisis, they're probably meant to go. And that frees up space for something else. And perhaps, I've had more than one crisis. I've had 4. So things keep happening that way, and I'm not sure why. Perhaps I keep trying to reincorporate things that are just that aren't meant to work for me. But to go with the whole losing part of my own function, or losing part of my ego functions, some social functions, and then freeing up space. What was the space freed up for? And some of that, I feel like it's freed up to be I don't know if it's freed up to be a visionary per se, but a lot of the experience I had in the crisis state, and I don't like the word crisis, I don't like the word psychosis, I don't like the word mania. Hopefully one day I don't have to say those anymore. And, I'd like to say things more like unusual states of consciousness, or extreme states of consciousness, or non-ordinary states of consciousness, or visionary states. And states implies that they change. So in a visionary state, or in an extreme state of consciousness, a lot of the experience is visionary or internally subjective. The information is coming from inside, the meaning is coming from inside, and all of a sudden so much of my life feels meaningful. But it's almost like as the ego dissolves, or is displaced at least, so much more of it is visionary and meaningful, and much less of it is my own personal ego stuff. So perhaps after the crisis, this visionary experience that comes in displaces a lot of the ego stuff. And maybe that's what makes some of it go away. So all of a sudden this ego, I know who I am, I believe this, I think that, I this, all the repetitive thoughts is replaced by a lot of times visions and thoughts of things that are more meaningful or also terrifying and scary. It's not all good. If it was all good, I'm sure everyone would want this thing to happen. So if it's displaced some of the ego stuff, there still is that visionary element. And perhaps whatever that visionary element is that comes in is there to inform the new creation of the ego structure, because it is important to have an ego in today's reality in order to relate. It is important to have a sense of who a person is. Maybe one day the ego will be more obsolete, but all this visionary stuff and meaning can reinform the ego, and it can reinform a person's life and what they choose to do next. And so often, because the story is, well, this is a mental illness and here are your medications for life, and the medications are very dulling, then that visionary experience or that non-ordinary state just turns into, okay, well, now you have a mental illness and deal with it and recover. When it could be, if it was handled or received in a different way, what's going on for you. Visionary stuff is you can harvest it, you can help it to utilize it to inform your life. Your ego structure is breaking down, like what do you choose to incorporate into it, as opposed to all this stuff that was just there throughout the process of one's life by default. I feel like it's really important. It's an important time for somebody to really get in alignment with what they want to do with their life. So a lot of people end up, unfortunately, on disability and not doing much but watching TV. Well, a person can be on disability and from their visionary experience be creating something based on what they harvested from one of their extreme states of consciousness of something they're really passionate about. A person doesn't need to be manic to be passionate about something. If I get a message or a feeling or a sense in Mania that there's a certain cause that I want to be involved in, I don't think I have to be manic in order to participate in that. So what I'm saying is, certain elements can be harvested from those extreme states of consciousness and those extreme experiences that are still congruent, and probably more congruent with daily life, that perhaps if a person incorporates into their lifestyle design will prevent further relapse, because a person has moved towards living in alignment with what was coming up for them in that extreme state of meaningfulness. And so many of us are suffering from a lack of meaning. So to have that state of extreme meaningfulness, just because it ends with, it's not sustainable, because life and the world isn't designed as a visionary place. Like, we don't all walk around assuming everyone's having visions and meaningful stuff and looking for synchronicity and magic. Maybe one day we will, but we just go about our business and allow people to do the same. So what I'm saying is, in those extreme states, things can be harvested to use in one's consensus reality life, because they did have meaning. And maybe they're not felt as meaningful now, but it doesn't mean they're not meaningful. Maybe they're the things that will actually move a person towards that sense of meaningfulness. And do that in an embodied way. So when it happens as the meaningful state in the extreme state, it's usually quite disembodied. It's not something that I'm actively participating in. So if I feel all of a sudden really drawn to the cause of homelessness, I might be feeling it and seeing homeless people and feeling like, oh my gosh, and giving them some money, but I'm not necessarily engaged in that in my daily embodied life, which once I come back to the embodied consensus reality state, even though I might have like a hangover from psychosis, just from being in that state, and it feels like a hangover, because if you can imagine being in a state of absolute meaning for 2 months, like so much meaning, everything is so meaningful, possible, There's so many associations and possibilities. And then even the scary part of it, which is meaningfully terrified in what's called psychosis. After coming back to consensus reality, usually through being medicated or something, it feels terrible. It feels, no wonder there's often a depression, which is what I experienced, because it goes from feeling so meaningful to the normal state of being feels super meaningless, even though it's just the sort of consensus felt sense of what we all assume normal reality is. But it feels terrible because of the contrast. So again, that's why it's not good to get too high beyond the consensus reality, because once snapped back to the level of consensus reality, it feels worse than consensus reality, because it's like the equal and opposite thing. And I think there's a certain amount that can be done to help society level up a little bit, but it's difficult. It's difficult to remain feeling higher than consensus reality. And some people, they do it by, say, taking some kind of illicit drug every day. But then a person is off in their own personal pleasure and bliss and feeling like one with God, maybe, or however it feels, but that's not how everyone else feels. So then a person, even though they feel one with everything, they're kind of there by themselves. And then it also takes a toll on the body, on the physical structure, to always be taking some kind of chemical or substance, whether natural or not, to elevate oneself beyond sort of the daily existence. And I feel like there's certain things that can be done to level up the consensus feeling of daily existence. So slowly over time, consensus reality supposedly gets a little better and better. For example, with different human rights issues. So a population that was marginalized 50 years ago is now more or less part of the mainstream, give or take. And that levels up, say, the consensus level of happiness, because more and more people are able to be happy because they're not seen as something less than a human being. And there's still a long, long way to go in this respect. Why are there still wars? Why are there homeless people? Why do some men think they can just rape a woman? Why are those things happening? And so until the world is a completely safe place for every single human being, it's not going to be a magical, wonderful, playful place for every single human being. Now, maybe some people experience that. But over time, slowly, certain things become less acceptable, and there's more consensus happiness. And when I'm in an extreme state of consciousness, I can feel and perceive injustice more so than normal. So when I'm in regular consciousness, I can walk by a homeless person on the street and feel bad, or feel happy and be like, wow, you're free from society's stuff. It doesn't look very fun, but you don't have to, there's a lot of things you don't have to do, a lot of stresses you don't have to have. More so you have the stress of survival, but not all of these other games that people have invented after survival wasn't an issue anymore, that really have no basis in reality except that we've created in our own minds. But anyways, if I was in an extreme state of consciousness, I would think this is not right. I would maybe give more money, or I would have a conversation with the person. And I've heard of some people that when they're manic, they go out and they get homeless people off the street and they bring them home so they can shower. And I remember hearing this story and hearing it in terms of this is what happens when the person is ill. And I'm thinking to myself, that's beautiful, like that's amazing. Obviously it's not, it's not safe or whatever they would say, but it's still beautiful that somebody would go out and get somebody and say, hey, come here and have a shower. Imagine if just like a handful of people were doing that. Well, I guess there's charities and things doing that, but if we just as human beings were reaching out like that to different people, as opposed to everything that's going on, the world would be a different place. I think that is a beautiful action. But it's not something I would recommend. Like, it's something I could see myself doing in an extreme state of consciousness, but it's, logically, in logical consensus, reality, rational consciousness, it's not something that a female should do. But in that heart-centered consciousness, where a person isn't thinking about their own personal safety, as in me and my ego, and if you kill me, me and all my memories are gone. There's so many people getting killed this instant in war, which is like, oh, don't kill me, but go and kill everybody overseas. Like, I'm precious, but what about the people that are out there dying? So for a person to just put their ego aside and help somebody like that. One thing I did one time was, when I was super manic, was I sort of had this sense inside that said, look for yellow. So I was looking for yellow, and so I saw this man with a yellow Visi vest, and he was a homeless man. And I took him for coffee at Tim Hortons. And we had a beautiful talk, and he had such a beautiful heart. And he told me about how he'd helped start this dream center in a city in Canada. And then he was giving me instructions on how to help start the dream center here where I live. And when he was telling me about it, it's like I was writing, but the pen was like moving by itself, and my handwriting was completely different. It was like that moment conspired to give me those instructions. And then I gave him a big hug, and then I got really cold and I took a taxi cab home, but it felt like I was in like this time warp, like this, I don't know. And sometimes I've actually dissociated, and I feel like a homeless person. And sometimes I think this homeless man is me. Like, he's like a different version of me. Like, if I wasn't a complete consciousness, he would be like another piece of my consciousness. Not as in mine, but it just made me feel like he was this man with this vision, and he was homeless, so perhaps not accepting mainstream help for supposed, mental illness or something. And actually, I think he had a home, but I think it was like some crappy place. Like super bad. And so he was definitely in extreme poverty. And he was just a beautiful man, and I don't even know how I started on that topic, but basically some of these, I guess one thing is some of the experiences in mania, like in my normal consciousness, I wouldn't take a homeless person to coffee. Like maybe I would if I was like, I'm gonna go out do an intentional act of kindness, and I'm gonna go find a homeless person and take them for coffee. And there's a lot of outreach workers who are employed to do outreach and take a homeless person into coffee, or to try to reach out and get people off the streets and things. But in normal consensus consciousness, we're quite able to walk by a lot of injustices. Whereas in mania, it's very difficult to walk by anything. So in that way, a person can easily be like a ping pong ball, going from one thing to the next that they see, that they're trying to help with or resolve. And that could be a good job. Like if somebody was like always going into mania, give this person a salary and say, hey, go out and do as much good as you can, as much as you see. Like, why do we need to categorize things and have all these job descriptions? It's like, do people actually know what to do? Maybe people actually do know what to do if we just really got together and did it. But so yeah, I don't even know where I was going with that. If I don't get back on track with it, I'll have to watch this and find out what I was saying, because I think part of it was to do with finding one's cause, and that's, I guess, partly why I feel like my cause is to do with homelessness, even though maybe my cause was that because of that thing that happened where I met that homeless man, and he sort of told me what to do, and I've never really acted on it. And the thing is that I've had this sense that we are the homeless people. If we are one, we are the homeless people as well. And oh yeah, I think I was saying something about how it's not great for daily existence to be in that state of consciousness. And that's one of the reasons. If I was always manic, I would just be seeing something, acting all the time. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's not really how society is designed. And so if I was to take my own thoughts here that I'm saying and go back and look at my manic experience, I would say, okay, perhaps I should in some way start working in homelessness, because that's really what I was responding to a lot when I was in that state. And sometimes I wonder if people, if they want to be homeless, the homeless people, there are unborn children. They're